Hello and welcome to Not Just Ads. Kieran Delaney, founder and CEO at FlatPlan, an expert on Apple News. So, Kieran, welcome to this podcast, and let's immediately deep dive into Apple News, Apple News Plus, and maybe we can start with describing the platform.
Sure, absolutely. So, great to be here. I love talking about Apple News. Apple News is preloaded on many modern devices in the UK, US, Australia, and Canada. So it's available primarily in those four territories. It is Apple's news app. It's curated partly by Apple's human editorial team. And very heavily by personalization as well. So if you're on an iPhone and you're in one of those territories, you will find it preloaded on your device. You click it, and you'll be met with a stream of stories from tend to be large publishers that come from those territories themselves. So it's a wide platform. There's two elements to it. There's a free version, which anyone with an Apple account can access in those territories, and then there's a paid subscription version as well, which is partly sold as a subscription on its own, but also bundled within Apple's Apple One account as well. So that's Apple News.
What is the business model and how should media brands approach it?
As I mentioned, there's two elements to it. So I'll kind of explain both of them separately. So the free version, which is kind of commonly known as just Apple News, it's free to the reader, but it's advertising supported. So Apple allows publishers to run direct sold campaigns into any of their content, any of their channels. And they also allow now for a couple of publisher side partners to sell ads on publishers' behalf to traffic into there, and also to run Apple's own backfill advertising into there as well. You can also monetize if you're a publisher through affiliates, branded content, the kind of stuff that in general you may already be doing across your own environment. And that's the kind of free product. Then you have Apple News Plus, and Apple News Plus is essentially set up as a subscription the reader pays for, and the revenue is split then between Apple and the publishers. Apple takes 50% of the revenue as a subscription from their side, and then they split the other 50% amongst all of the publishers that have been invited into the program, split out by the amount of time that readers spend with that content.
What is the barrier to entry to the free product versus Apple News Plus?
Good question. So both elements are now invite only, really. So Apple will reach out to publishers and say, "We're interested in you joining Apple News or Apple News Plus. Here are the details. Here's how you can deliver to the platform." The bar is pretty high, and a lot of the reason for that is that lots of publishers are already publishing. Lots of publishers of a certain size are already publishing into Apple News, and certainly in Apple News Plus, there's actually a mixture of the bar is high because Apple isn't, necessarily looking for more publishers at this moment in time. But also Apple is conscious that opening up the number of publications that are delivering into the subscription does mean that if that's opened up too far, publishers as a whole will receive less revenue overall. So they play a game really of balancing it. As the subscriptions to the product grow, they invite more publishers to publish into Apple News Plus, and that tends to be a relatively slow process.
From a technical perspective, when you mention advertising and subscriptions, is there something different that needs to be done by publishers than they weren't doing anyway? So, for example, the serving of advertising sold by different sources, either the publisher or Apple, the subscription, which is managed by Apple. How does it work from a technical perspective?
There's a number of sort of technical complexities with Apple News, and one thing I should say, Apple News presents all content from all publishers within the app, so in a native format. So unlike some platforms where an article arrives, the reader clicks it and they go through to the website itself. With Apple News, it's loaded in app within a native article itself. Now, the reason that Apple does that is that because they want the articles to load really quickly, they want control over tracking and user data and all of those kinds of elements. and they want it to feel like an Apple product. So when you open Apple News, it's a very beautiful looking kind of news product overall. But the other complexities that come into it, and so really what that means is that the publishers need to find a way to deliver into that format overall. But then on top of that, when we talk about the monetization element of things, you do need your ad trafficking team to kind of approach it as a kind of slightly separate, add-on to what they're already doing. And what I mean by that is that, yeah, you can't plug in your kind of existing programmatic setup into Apple News because of the privacy element. You can plug your ad trafficking software. If you use Google Ad Manager 360, you can set up IAB standard ad units to run from Google Ad Manager into Apple News as well. But there's an element in between, which is Apple's system called Workbench that needs to be configured as well. And then, so that's obviously working on a kind of direct display area. And then after that, you just need to set up the partners that sit below. And some of that's super simple. Activating backfill ads from Apple is very simple. There's a few steps to take, and then that starts to run. And one thing that we do also mention is that set up a waterfall campaign so that has house ads running on the bottom. At the bottom of that waterfall as well. So that's the free side. On Apple News Plus, as you mentioned, yes, Apple is actively looking at the minutes that are spent with your content. They are, and every month they will pay out, a subscription revenue to the publisher on their behalf. And really, the name of the game from a technical perspective is for the publisher to be looking to drive those minutes and increase those minutes that the readers spend with their content, as opposed to competitors, really.
So engagement is a key element.
Absolutely. So in both instances, it does really boil down to engagement. There's kind of two key behaviors that really matter in Apple News. So the first one is the personalization element. So how do we make sure that the algorithm understands that the reader who opens Apple News on their phone or on their device will see more of our content? The way we do that, so Apple starts off at a really pretty strong place anyway. So Apple will understand that that reader has downloaded a certain set of apps that might show that they're interested in cookery or sport or anything along those lines. But then after that, once and there's also areas. So on an article, if an article is talking about a specific topic and you as a publisher have covered that topic as well, you have a good chance of your stories being surfaced there. So we can see sometimes smaller publishers that are producing content on a real niche but really well researched are finding their way to audiences from being featured next to a Wall Street Journal article that has that attracts a really large audience. So once you've got the audience visiting your content, what you want to do then is send every signal you can to the Apple News algorithm to say, let's keep them coming back, basically. So two elements of that are the action of following a channel. So that's the user saying, I want to see more from this publication. And the other one is again, it's the active time, really. It's the length of journeys. So how can a publisher make sure that the reader goes to one article, then they click another, and increase that journey as much as possible? When either of those two actions are taken, the algorithm says, okay, this reader is certainly engaged with this content. Let's start showing it in all of those different personalized areas of the app.
Again, going back to keywords, mention a lot of topics that have been in the history of the relationship between media companies and the big platforms. They're being fraught with a lot of issues in the past. Last but not least, the danger of basically gifting the audience to the platform, losing the audience, losing very valuable insights, losing data, not receiving enough data, cannibalizing your audience, and I could go on and on and on with this list. How does it work and why it is different? Because we already had a few conversations on the topic, and you feel that this is different.
I do. I mean, I think there's an element that you have to be where your audience is, right? So if your audience is opening a news app on their phone and they have a wonderful experience, it's personalized, it talks to them about their interests, then, as a publisher, in many instances, it makes sense to be there. Um, but what needs to happen is that Apple News channel needs to work for you as a publisher. So the kind of the one beauty, I guess, of Apple News format is that you can build the articles to work how you would like them to work. So we would say to publishers, make sure that you are triggering options for readers to essentially move into your newsletter or your app from Apple News itself. So use that opportunity and meet the audience by making sure the audience know who you are and what you offer that is outside of Apple News. Apple News itself is a very article-driven experience. We see often less than 2% of readers are going to a publication in Apple News itself, whereas a huge amount of that audience is going to articles directly because of the way that the experience is set up. Now, if a reader comes to your publication, they've discovered it, let's say through a really big publisher that your story is alongside, you have every opportunity at that time to say, engage more, and then build that journey into a newsletter or an app or whatever is important to you. We see publishers that are utilizing it to drive podcast subscriptions as well. This is sometimes a really tricky way to. It's sometimes tricky to build subscribers to podcasts. Apple News allows you to do that in one tap. So really, I think that it's there. The audience is there. It's sizable. The last time the audience size was released by Apple, it was something like 145 million monthly active users, 5 billion article views a month. I think was the number that was given out. And so if it's there, make sure that it's not. Make sure that you're utilizing it to send that reader into your funnel overall and gain that first party data.
So there is an open bridge, an open channel to bring the audience, to attract the audience into your own and operated properties.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that people are sometimes quite surprised about that when we say, Apple is fine with you including a nice big mechanic for driving newsletter subscriptions. But in fact, Apple has kind of taken that further. So with certain publications now built into Apple's UI, there's a click through from Apple News that Apple controls that sends the reader off into newsletters. I think Apple understands that for publishers, this is important. And so they're actively, happy to do that. I think you can imagine that when it comes to app downloads, there's an interest from Apple to be allowing that to happen as well. There are many reasons that Apple is fine with directing readers to the App Store. But I think from the publisher perspective, we need to think about how we can make that as engaging and captivating to the user as possible. It's not a case of just a line of text that sits at the end of the article saying, by the way, we have a newsletter. We do things like we look at, what about the context of that article? If the article is a US politics article and we have a newsletter that's about, an election that's coming up, let's make sure that we're using graphics and copy to make sure that we drive that reader to say, yes, I want to get that newsletter. And similarly, that's a strategy to take as a whole when it comes to any of the elements that you'd like to promote in Apple News itself.
And I know the objection that a media owner could raise, and it's about the data, for example, but also how the data is used across the different participants. Can you shed some light on this aspect?
Absolutely. So, absolutely. I mean, I think that this becomes more complex when we talk about Apple News Plus, really, which is the subscription side of the business. If you are, if you understand that Apple is essentially, collecting subscriptions to a subscription product, there's definitely some decisions you need to make internally about how you approach that. Do you want readers to cancel their subscriptions, your owned and operated subscriptions, and move into Apple News? And if the package becomes too valuable and there's a kind of subscription fatigue element, there's a chance that could happen, for sure. I think the element of reinforcing that brand and going further and explaining what's available outside of Apple News and Apple News Plus, that's really important. I think if we look at the Atlantic as an example, they're one of the publishers that we deliver their content into Apple News. We deliver their free content, there's their magazine content, and then additional subscription content as well. But what Atlantic is always doing is looking to make sure that it's clear to the end user in Apple News that there's a lot more that you can get from that from the package, from the Atlantic website itself. So you don't need to offer everything from your subscription offering to Apple News Plus. you do need to offer a substantial amount. It's not a case of it won't necessarily be a winning subscription to say a winning route to say, we will deliver 2 articles a day to Apple News, and we'll deliver, 15 in our own product. But make sure that you offer a really compelling reason for the reader to subscribe directly, and then you've got this continual trickle of content going into a platform that they open regularly, and a reason for them to subscribe to get a lot more.
What you said in the last 20 minutes raised a question, an existential question in my mind, and it's if media brands collaborate effectively to Apple News, why is it so hard for them to collaborate outside of it?
Good question. I mean, I think I would argue that media brands are not particularly collaborating when it comes to Apple News either. I think what we try to do our side is to share what we see across our network in an anonymized way, and give publishers an understanding of how to make it work for them. Um, Ultimately, I think there is occasionally a problem when it comes to our industry of looking for the short-term wins, and not necessarily looking to look at the long-term strategy. I think that building any kind of news platform, even if it was, if we were to talk about, a Spotify style news platform that was owned primarily by the publishers, the problem with that is that ultimately, from a publisher's perspective, you always want the reader to be in your owned and operated platform. In many instances, you do. And so for most news platforms, and we've seen many of them, rise and fall in the past, it's really difficult to build that as a business model. The reason that Apple is able to do it is because they're on device. They have this huge network already that they can start with. And publishers know that. Publishers are there for good reason. They know there's a strong audience. This is about helping publishers, right? I mean, I've been within this industry for 15 years, and it's never been trickier, right? And so ultimately, you mentioned this earlier, how can publishers work together and all that kind of stuff? We need to. We really do need to.
So if I'm a publication and I've decided to embrace the Apple News Plus ecosystem environment, whatever we want to call it, what are the suggestions for growth on that channel, but not only on that channel, as a media brand overall?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say if you're looking to drive growth in Apple News, I would spend a lot of time looking at those engagement metrics. So I would say look at how you can ensure that readers are, first of all, seeing enough of your content. A lot of that comes down to setup. We've spoken a little bit about the technicals, but making sure that the algorithm understands exactly what you're publishing content around. Once it understands that, it will start to surface that around the app exactly as you'd like. Once you've got readers coming to your content, look at driving those return visits, playing to that algorithm, look at increasing the length of those user journeys. And then really what you're looking to do, if we're talking about an Apple News Plus publication, is you're looking to ensure that anyone who is likely to be very interested and potentially become loyal within the platform is going to have every opportunity to engage with that content. So one thing that sometimes surprises publishers when we speak to them is that if you publish stories underneath Apple News Plus paywall, that notches up more minutes and drives more revenue. But if you are an Apple News Plus publisher and you're delivering your free content, which can be, shorter pieces, news pieces, anything along those lines, if that subscriber looks at any of that content, whether that be free or behind the paywall, they are notching up minutes, and that is increasing your revenue overall. So it gives you this really nice opportunity to say, well, we've got a magazine that we deliver into Apple News Plus, but we have a website that also delivers continually, breaking news content, continual content. And working together, we're seeing a lot more revenue coming in from Apple News Plus. We're also now seeing publishers that are seeing enough of a return in Apple News Plus that they're beginning to create content for Apple News Plus alone. So we have publishers that are creating mini magazines. So these are kind of periodical publishers that are saying, well, we've got lots of evergreen content on a specific subject. Why don't we package that up as an Apple News Plus magazine, release it, and then have the audience come to the magazine, engage with all of that content. It's, of course, again, often appealing to a specific niche as well. And we have publishers as well that are understanding that the magazine element is great, but why not add more kind of magazine-led single articles into the platform as well. So we have publishers that are saying, we know that the Apple News reader is really interested in these long form reads about this specific topic. We'll just create some more. We'll deliver that into Apple News Plus, and then we'll track to see that the revenue returns from it, and kind of go from there. We've all, or many of us that have been in the industry for a while, have been kind of burnt by spending too much time and resource, creating content specifically for the platforms. But I would say in this instance, it's worth experimenting with and not putting too much resource into, but looking at if you can get a really good ROI from delivering this specific content.
Is this not, and obviously you don't have control on this, but you have insights. Is this not creating yet another silo within a media organization? How are your clients, or what do you see usually? Is this integrated? Is it aligned with the different revenue channels and the company's objectives?
Yeah, so one of the problems with Apple News that I will say is that it does silo lots of different elements actually. So one of the we've spoken a little about the technical issues. One of the other elements with Apple News is that analytics are held separately. So you can't just plug Google Analytics in. You have a separate dashboard for that. Thankfully, it's a really nice to use dashboard. It's pretty simple to use and all that kind of stuff. But it does mean that editorial teams are actually often spending their time looking at two separate tabs as opposed to one from before. And that can sometimes lead to publishers not giving it enough attention, really, in many ways. Then we have, the additional revenue streams that again sit separately to the kind of, the dashboards that, the other members of the team may be looking at as well. We have Apple News Plus revenue. Where does that sit? Is that subscription revenue? Where does that sit within the business? So there is always going to be an element of the silo, as you mentioned. I would say that, the other thing to kind of take into account is that Apple News can, I've mentioned about, diving into it and creating content for Apple News specifically, but Apple News can, once you've got it set up correctly and it's working, it can be, it can go off and you can just publish, the article can deliver, it can deliver, the traffic and all that kind of stuff without requiring too much hands-on work, really. It's the size of the publisher, the resources you have, your goals as a publisher will affect how you should approach it, really.
And if you are a media company, should you focus on customer acquisition or ROI?
Good question. I think that really you need to be looking at ROI. I think one of the problems with, from our side as a software business, we, commonly within the industry, we track customer acquisition cost. This is the typical thing that we track. The problem with doing that is often it leads to too many quick wins and acquiring not the best quality customers, really. I think that if we think about ROI as a better metric overall, we can start to see that this is not about, oh, we've brought in these customers that churn really quickly within subscriptions. We've actually brought in this customer that has offered a really good lifetime value and set things up in that way. I think that's a much better way to track those kinds of things.
Kieran, thank you very much for this deep dive into the Apple News world, and all the best.
Aisha, great to speak to you.